September 15, 1943. The harvest moon hung low over Fairbury, Nebraska, casting long shadows across cornfields that stretched to the horizon. In farmhouses throughout Lancaster County, families gathered around radio sets to hear news of American forces pushing through Italy, driving back the very men who had once marched alongside Hitler's armies. But on this particular evening, something unprecedented was about to arrive in this quiet farming community of 3,000 souls. A convoy of military trucks wound its way down Highway 77, carrying 200 Italian prisoners of war to a hastily constructed camp on the outskirts of town. These weren't the first enemy soldiers most Americans had seen in newspapers or newsreels, but they were the first that Fairbury's residents would see with their own eyes, living and breathing just beyond a fence of barbed wire. 22-year-old Catherine Miller stood on her family's front porch, watching the convoy pass. Her younger brother, Thomas, had been killed at Anzio just 4 months earlier, cut down by Italian machine gun fire during the Allied invasion. The telegram had arrived on a Tuesday morning in May, and her mother hadn't stopped wearing black since. Now here they were, Italian soldiers, being brought to their town, to the very place where Thomas had learned to drive a tractor, where he had courted Mary Beth Hansen before shipping out, where his absence felt like a wound that wouldn't heal. Catherine's father, Robert Miller, stood beside her with his jaw clenched tight. He owned 400 acres of prime farmland, and with most of the young men gone to war, he was facing the impossible task of bringing in the harvest with only his daughter and a handful of men too old or too infirm for military service. The government had sent notices to farmers throughout the county, explaining that Italian POWs would be available for agricultural labor under Guard supervision. The wages would go to the U.S. Treasury, and the prisoners would work under strict protocols. Robert had read the notice 3 times before throwing it in the trash. He would rather lose his entire crop than accept help from the enemy who had killed his son. But Catherine understood what her father couldn't bring himself to acknowledge. Without help, they would lose everything. The farm that had been in the Miller family for 3 generations would fail, not from enemy action overseas, but from simple mathematics. There weren't enough hands to work the land. As the last truck in the convoy disappeared around the bend, Catherine made a silent promise to herself. She would do whatever it took to save her family's farm, even if it meant working alongside the men who wore the same uniform as her brother's killers. The first week of October brought an early frost that threatened to ruin the corn crop if it wasn't harvested immediately. Robert Miller finally accepted reality and signed the papers authorizing the use of prisoner labor on his farm. He didn't speak about the decision, simply posted the necessary forms and waited for the truck to arrive with his assigned workers. On the morning of October 7th, Catherine watched from the kitchen window as 6 Italian prisoners climbed down from a military transport accompanied by 2 American guards. They wore faded uniforms with large yellow POW letters stenciled on the backs of their shirts. Most looked desperately thin, their faces gaunt with the kind of hunger that comes from months of inadequate rations. One prisoner in particular caught her attention. He was taller than the others, perhaps 25 years old, with dark, curly hair and brown eyes that seemed to take in everything with quiet intensity. Unlike his companions who kept their gazes down, this man looked directly at the farmhouse, at the barn, at the fields stretching beyond, as if memorizing every detail of this place that was so different from wherever he had come from. His name, she would learn later, was Marco Rossini, from a small village outside Florence. He had been a teacher before the war, drafted into an army he never believed in, captured in North Africa after his unit surrendered to British forces, and eventually transferred to American custody. He spoke enough English to understand basic commands, learned from an American missionary who had taught at his village school when Marco was a boy. For the first 3 days, Catherine avoided the fields where the prisoners worked. She prepared lunch and left it on the porch for the guards to distribute, never making eye contact, never acknowledging the men who had come to save her family's harvest. But on the 4th day, she noticed something that changed everything. Marco had collapsed in the cornfield. The October sun beat down mercilessly despite the morning frost, and the prisoners had been working since dawn with only a piece of bread and weak coffee for breakfast. She watched from a distance as the guards ordered him to stand, but his legs wouldn't support him. One guard raised his rifle, not threateningly, but impatiently, as if dealing with a stubborn animal. Something broke inside Catherine at that moment. Whatever these men had done in the war, whatever uniform they wore, watching a human being collapse from hunger while she had a pantry full of food felt wrong in a way that transcended politics or patriotism. She walked to the house, ignoring her father's questioning look, and returned with a canteen of cold water and half a chocolate bar from her carefully hoarded ration. The chocolate bar Catherine brought to Marco that October afternoon became a turning point neither of them could have anticipated. He looked at her with such surprise, such genuine gratitude, that for a moment she forgot he was supposed to be her enemy. His hands trembled slightly as he accepted the water and the chocolate, and he spoke his first words to her in careful, accented English. "Thank you, Signorina. You are very kind." She nodded and walked away quickly, feeling the weight of the guard's stares and her own confusion about what she had just done. But something had shifted. Over the following weeks, as the harvest continued, Catherine found herself paying more attention to the prisoners working in the fields. She noticed that Marco always helped the weaker men carry heavier loads, that he shared his meager rations with those who seemed more desperately hungry, that he worked with a quiet dignity that seemed out of place in his prisoner uniform. The guards had relaxed their vigilance as the days passed without incident. The Italians weren't trying to escape. Where would they go in the middle of rural Nebraska? They had no money, no contacts, and most barely spoke English. The camp where they were housed each night was surrounded by hundreds of miles of farmland. Escape wasn't just impractical, it was pointless. This growing informality meant that sometimes Catherine found herself working near the prisoners, showing them which corn was ready for harvest, how to handle the equipment without damaging it. Marco proved to be a quick learner with an almost scholarly attention to detail. He asked questions about farming techniques, about the soil, about the weather patterns in Nebraska compared to Italy. These conversations started as purely practical exchanges, but gradually evolved into something more. One afternoon, in late October, while sorting corn in the barn, Marco mentioned that he had been a literature teacher before the war. He spoke about Dante and Petrarch with the same passion her brother Thomas had once shown when talking about engines and machinery. Catherine found herself mentioning that she had loved reading before the war consumed everything, that she had dreamed of going to college in Lincoln to study English literature, dreams that seemed foolish now when every resource went toward survival and victory. Marco's eyes lit up with recognition of a kindred spirit. Before either of them fully understood what they were doing, they had begun a conversation that would continue in stolen moments between work tasks, in brief exchanges that felt dangerous and thrilling precisely because they weren't supposed to be happening. By early November, Marco had begun writing short passages from Italian poetry on scraps of paper, leaving them hidden under a particular stone near the water pump. Catherine would find them and painstakingly translate them using an old Italian-English dictionary from the town library. Winter arrived early in 1943, bringing with it a bitter cold that matched the growing tension in Fairbury. Rumors had begun circulating about Catherine Miller spending too much time talking with the Italian prisoners working on her family's farm. At first, the gossip was quiet, whispered between neighbors at the general store or after Sunday services at First Lutheran Church. But by mid-November, the whispers had grown into open accusations. Sarah Jennings, whose husband was fighting with Patton's army in Sicily, confronted Catherine outside the post office. "My Harold is over there risking his life fighting those people," Sarah said loudly enough for everyone on Main Street to hear. "And here you are, chatting with them like they're invited guests instead of prisoners." Catherine felt her face flush with anger and shame. "They're working our harvest, Sarah. The same harvest that feeds our troops overseas." But Sarah wasn't finished. "Your own brother died fighting them, Catherine. Thomas would be ashamed to see you making nice with his killers." The words hit like a physical blow. Catherine wanted to explain that Marco hadn't killed Thomas, that not every Italian soldier was personally responsible for every American death, that the world was more complicated than simple categories of us and them. But the fury in Sarah's eyes and the growing crowd of onlookers told her that explanations wouldn't matter. The town had already made up its mind. That evening, someone threw a rock through the miller's front window. Attached was a note written in crude block letters, "Enemy lovers not welcome." Robert Miller found his daughter sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the broken glass scattered across the floor. He had known about Catherine's conversations with the Italian prisoner. He had chosen to ignore them because the work was getting done, and his daughter seemed less hollow than she had been since Thomas's death. But this was different. This was the town turning against them. "Catherine," he said quietly, sitting down across from her, "you need to stop talking to that Italian boy." She looked up at her father with tears in her eyes. "His name is Marco. And he's not a boy. He's a man who was drafted into a war he didn't believe in, just like Thomas was." Robert sighed heavily. "That may be true. But it doesn't change what people think. It doesn't change that your brother died fighting Italy." Catherine stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the wooden floor. "Thomas died fighting fascism, Papa. He died fighting for freedom and justice. He didn't die so that we could hate every single person who happened to be born in the wrong country." The conversation ended there, with father and daughter staring at each other across a divide that neither knew how to bridge. December brought snow and scandal. Catherine wasn't the only woman in Lancaster County whose heart had complicated the simple mathematics of war and enemy. By Christmas of 1943, at least 3 other relationships had developed between local women and Italian prisoners working on area farms. Each romance followed a similar pattern: initial hostility or indifference, gradual recognition of shared humanity, and then something deeper that defied the boundaries of barbed wire and national allegiance. Maria Kowalski, a 28-year-old widow whose husband had died at Pearl Harbor, had fallen in love with Antonio Benedetti, a prisoner working at the Schmidt dairy farm. Helen Patterson, whose fiancé was missing in action in the Pacific, had developed feelings for Giuseppe Romano, a former vineyard owner from Sicily. And most scandalously of all, Reverend William Harrison's daughter, Elizabeth, had been discovered exchanging letters with a prisoner named Luca Marchetti. The revelation about Elizabeth Harrison sent shockwaves through Fairbury's tight-knit community. Reverend Harrison was the moral authority of the town, the man who had delivered patriotic sermons every Sunday since Pearl Harbor, who had blessed the young men as they left for war and comforted their families when they didn't return. The idea that his own daughter could betray everything he stood for by falling in love with an enemy prisoner seemed like a violation of the natural order. The Reverend called a town meeting at the church on the 15th of December. Nearly every family in Fairbury attended, packing into the wooden pews while snow fell steadily outside. Reverend Harrison stood at the pulpit, his face drawn with exhaustion and shame. "We are facing a moral crisis," he began, his voice heavy with emotion. "Our boys are dying overseas fighting for our freedom, and here at home we are fraternizing with the enemy. This must stop." He looked directly at his daughter, who sat in the front row with her head held high despite the tears streaming down her face. "I love my daughter," he continued, "but I cannot condone what she has done. I cannot accept this betrayal of everything we are fighting for." Elizabeth stood slowly, her hands trembling but her voice steady. "Papa, you taught me that Christ commands us to love our enemies. You taught me that every person has dignity and worth in God's eyes. How can you now ask me to forget those teachings just because they've become inconvenient?" The church erupted in murmurs and angry voices. Some supported Elizabeth's words, moved by her courage and her appeal to Christian principles. But most saw her argument as sophistry, a clever twisting of Scripture to justify what they considered treason. The confrontation at the church marked the beginning of the town's most painful winter. Families divided over the question of the Italian prisoners. Some, particularly those who had lost sons or husbands in the war, saw any kindness toward the prisoners as betrayal. Others, moved by Christian charity or simple human compassion, argued that the prisoners were victims of circumstance, young men who deserved basic decency regardless of the uniforms they had worn. Elizabeth Harrison became the focal point of this division. Unlike Catherine or the other women whose relationships had developed quietly, Elizabeth refused to hide or apologize. She continued to visit Luca Marchetti at the work camp, walking through town in broad daylight to meet him at the fence line where prisoners were allowed supervised visits with approved community members. Her father forbade her from living in the parsonage, forcing her to find room with a sympathetic widow on the edge of town. The community that had once revered the Harrison family now whispered about them with a mixture of pity and contempt. Luca Marchetti was different from the other Italian prisoners. He had been a seminary student in Rome before being drafted, studying to become a priest when Mussolini's call to arms interrupted his vocation. He spoke 5 languages and had a gentle philosophical nature that reminded Elizabeth of the scholars and missionaries who occasionally visited their small town. Their conversations ranged from theology to poetry to the fundamental questions about duty and conscience that the war had raised. How do you reconcile loving your country with knowing it has done terrible things? Elizabeth asked him during one of their visits, standing on opposite sides of the fence while a bored guard smoked a cigarette 20 feet away. Luca considered the question carefully, his breath forming clouds in the cold December air. I think we must separate the ideal of a nation from the actions of its leaders. I love Italy, the land, the people, the culture. But I cannot love what Mussolini made us become. Perhaps that is why I am here. God removed me from a situation where I would have been forced to participate in evil. Elizabeth found in Luca a depth of moral thinking that she rarely encountered in Fairbury. Her father, for all his learning and piety, saw the world in clear categories of right and wrong, American and enemy, faithful and faithless. Luca understood that reality was more complex, that good people could find themselves on the wrong side of history through no fault of their own, that redemption was always possible for those who sought it sincerely. The winter of 1943 gave way to spring of 1944, and with the changing seasons came changes in the war. American and British forces continued their advance through Italy, pushing north toward Rome. Each Allied victory brought the end of the war closer, but for the women of Fairbury, who had fallen in love with Italian prisoners, victory carried a terrible question. What would happen when the war ended? Catherine and Marco had long since stopped pretending their relationship was merely friendly. They met whenever possible, their conversations evolving from literature and farming to dreams and fears about the future. Marco spoke about his village in Tuscany, destroyed by bombing, his family scattered or dead. He had received one letter from his younger sister through the Red Cross, informing him that their parents had been killed when Allied planes mistakenly bombed a civilian convoy they believed was carrying German troops. The news had devastated Marco, but it had also freed him from the obligation to return to a home that no longer existed. Catherine shared her own grief about Thomas, finally able to talk about her brother without the numbing anger that had characterized the months after his death. She told Marco about Thomas's kindness, his humor, his dreams of owning his own garage someday. And gradually, she came to understand that loving Marco didn't diminish her love for her brother or betray his memory. Thomas had died fighting for a world where people could choose their own paths, where hatred and tyranny would be defeated by freedom and justice. In a strange way, her relationship with Marco honored that vision more than hatred ever could. On June 6, 1944, news reached Fairbury of the D-Day invasion. American, British, and Canadian forces had landed on the beaches of Normandy, opening a new front against Germany. The town erupted in celebration, bells ringing from the church steeple, people embracing in the streets. But for the 4 women whose hearts were entangled with Italian prisoners, the celebration was bittersweet. Every Allied victory brought them closer to the day when the prisoners would be repatriated, sent back to Italy, and their relationships would be forced to end. That summer, the prisoners were allowed more freedom, as it became clear they posed no security threat. They were permitted to attend community events under supervision, to participate in town celebrations, even to worship at local churches. Marco attended services at First Lutheran, sitting in the back pew while curious and sometimes hostile eyes watched his every movement. Catherine sat with her family in their usual pew near the front, but she felt Marco's presence like a physical warmth at her back. May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day brought delirious celebrations across America, but in Fairbury, Nebraska, the joy was complicated by an impossible question. Within weeks, the Italian prisoners would begin the process of repatriation. They would be processed through holding facilities, then transported to ships bound for Italy, and finally released to return to whatever remained of their former lives. For the four couples who had fallen in love across the barbed wire of captivity, this meant a reckoning. Marco and Catherine sat together on the miller's front porch on the evening of May 9th, the sounds of continued celebration drifting from town. The war was over, but they faced a battle of their own. "Come with me to Italy," Marco said, taking her hand. "We can rebuild together. Start fresh in Tuscany, in the hills where my family's farm once stood." Catherine felt the pull of his vision. She had read enough poetry, studied enough maps, to imagine the cypress trees and olive groves, the ancient villages perched on hillsides. But she also knew the reality. Italy was devastated, occupied by Allied forces, facing starvation and chaos. And she would be an American, in a land where Americans had been the enemy, where every bomb that had fallen carried an American stamp. "Or you could stay here," she offered quietly. "There must be a way. If we married, if you applied for citizenship." Marco shook his head sadly. "I am a prisoner of war, Catherine. I have no rights, no status. I cannot simply decide to stay because I fell in love. The laws do not work that way." But Catherine was her father's daughter, stubborn and resourceful when she believed in something. The next morning, she went to see Judge Morrison, the county's senior magistrate, and a man who had known her family for 3 generations. Judge Morrison listened to her explanation of the situation, his weathered face impassive. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "What you're asking isn't simple, Catherine. The regulations regarding enemy prisoners are clear. They are to be repatriated according to the Geneva Convention. But exceptions can be made," Catherine pressed. "I've done research. If we marry, if Marco can demonstrate he has means of support and will not be a burden to the state, if he renounces his Italian citizenship and swears loyalty to America." The judge sighed heavily. "Theoretically, yes, but the process takes months, maybe years, and it requires approval from the War Department, the State Department, and Immigration. Most importantly, it requires that the man in question be something other than a prisoner of war. The regulations don't allow prisoners to apply for immigration status while still in custody." The solution came from an unexpected source. Reverend Harrison, who had publicly denounced his own daughter's relationship with Luca Marchetti, experienced a crisis of conscience during the summer of 1945. He watched as the Italian prisoners prepared for repatriation, saw the genuine grief on their faces and the faces of the women who loved them, and began to question whether his rigid stance had been righteous or simply cruel. One evening in late June, he visited Judge Morrison with a proposal. If the prisoners could be released from military custody and transferred to civilian parole status, they could then apply for legal immigration while remaining in the United States. It would require a local sponsor to guarantee their behavior and their financial support, someone of impeccable standing in the community. "I will sponsor them," Reverend Harrison said. "All 4 of them, Luca, Marco, Antonio, and Giuseppe. I will take responsibility for their actions and their welfare until their immigration status is resolved." Judge Morrison stared at the minister in surprise. "Reverend, this will destroy what's left of your reputation in this town. Half your congregation already left after Elizabeth's situation became public." Harrison nodded slowly. "I know, but I've spent the past months asking myself what Christ would do in this situation. And I keep coming back to the same answer. He would choose mercy over judgment. He would choose love over hatred. I have failed my daughter by putting my pride before my principles. I won't fail these young people the same way." The process took 3 months of bureaucratic wrangling, but eventually, The War Department agreed to release the 4 Italian prisoners to civilian parole status under Reverend Harrison's sponsorship. On September 20, 1945, Marco Rossini and Catherine Miller were married in a quiet ceremony at First Lutheran Church. Fewer than 20 people attended. Catherine's father walked her down the aisle with tears streaming down his weathered face. Elizabeth Harrison served as maid of honor, standing beside her friend with quiet pride despite the hostile stares from outside where a small group of protesters had gathered. Reverend Harrison performed the ceremony himself, his voice breaking with emotion as he pronounced them husband and wife. "What we witness today," he told the small gathering, "is proof that love can survive even the worst that humanity inflicts upon itself." These 2 young people have chosen to build a future together despite every obstacle placed in their path. May God bless their union, and may their love serve as an example of reconciliation and hope. October 7, 1995. Catherine Rossini stood in the Fairbury Community Center, surrounded by nearly 200 people who had gathered to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the end of World War II. At 74 years old, her hair was silver, and her hands showed the wear of 5 decades of farm work, but her eyes still sparkled with the same determination that had led her to bring chocolate to a starving prisoner so many years ago. Beside her stood Marco, now 77, his dark curls long since turned white, but his gentle scholar's face still recognizable beneath the lines of age. Their 3 children and 7 grandchildren filled the first row of seats, a living testament to the choice Catherine and Marco had made half a century earlier. The community center displayed photographs and artifacts from the war years, including images of the prisoner of war camp that had once stood on the outskirts of town. But the centerpiece of the exhibition was a small, battered chocolate bar wrapper, carefully preserved in a frame. It was the wrapper from the Hershey bar Catherine had given to Marco on that October day in 1943, the simple act of kindness that had changed both their lives. The event had been organized by Catherine's daughter, Maria, a history professor at the University of Nebraska. She had spent 2 years researching the story of the Italian prisoners in Lancaster County and the 4 marriages that had resulted from their time in Fairbury. What she discovered had surprised her. Of the 200 Italian prisoners who had worked in the area during the war, 97 had eventually immigrated to the United States. Most had married American women, started businesses, raised families, and become integral parts of the communities that had once seen them as enemies. Marco and Catherine's farm had prospered over the decades. Marco had brought Italian farming techniques to Nebraska soil, introducing new crops and methods that other farmers had eventually adopted. He had also taught Italian language and literature at the local high school for 30 years, influencing generations of students with his gentle wisdom and his passion for education. Antonio and Maria Benedetti had opened a successful restaurant in Lincoln, bringing authentic Italian cuisine to the heartland. Giuseppe and Helen Romano had started a construction company that had built half the new buildings in the county over the past 4 decades. And Luca and Elizabeth Marchetti had served as missionaries, spending 20 years in South America before returning to Fairbury, where Luca served as associate pastor at First Lutheran, the same church that had once debated whether to allow him through its doors. As Catherine stood to address the gathering, she held the framed chocolate wrapper in her hands. "People often ask me," she began, her voice still strong despite her age, "whether I ever regretted my decision to marry an enemy prisoner. They ask whether my brother Thomas would have approved, whether I betrayed my country by falling in love with the enemy." She paused, looking out at the audience that included both those who had supported her 50 years ago and those who had opposed her. "The answer is simple. Thomas died fighting against hatred and tyranny. He died believing in a world where people could be judged by their character rather than their nationality. When I brought Marco that chocolate bar, when I chose to see him as a human being rather than just an enemy, I was honoring everything Thomas fought for." Marco stood beside his wife, adding his own reflection. "I was taught to hate Americans. I was told you were cruel and godless, that you cared only for money and power. But what I discovered in this small Nebraska town was the exact opposite. I found kindness, compassion, and the willingness to see beyond the uniforms and the propaganda to the human beings underneath. America gave me not just a new home, but a new life. A life built on love rather than hatred, on hope rather than despair. The gathering rose in a standing ovation that lasted several minutes. Among those applauding were the children and grandchildren of people who had once thrown rocks through the miller's window, who had protested at the wedding, who had sworn they would never accept the enemy in their midst. Time and the evidence of good lives well lived had changed minds that arguments never could have reached. That evening, as the celebration wound down, Catherine and Marco walked together through the streets of Fairbury. They passed the house where Catherine had grown up, now owned by one of their grandchildren. They walked by the church where they had married, despite opposition and protest. They stopped at the cemetery where Thomas Miller was buried, his grave marked by a simple stone that Catherine tended with fresh flowers every week. "Do you think he would have approved?" Marco asked quietly, the question that had haunted both of them for 50 years. Catherine touched the cold marble of her brother's headstone. "I think Thomas would have liked you. You both loved books. You both believed in kindness. You both understood that the real enemy was never the person on the other side of the battlefield, but the hatred that put them there in the first place." As they walked home under the October stars, Catherine reached into her pocket and pulled out a small piece of chocolate, carefully wrapped. It had become their private ritual, a reminder of where they had started and how far they had come. She broke it in half and gave one piece to Marco, and together they savored the sweetness, grateful for a simple act of kindness that had bridged the divide between enemy and friend, between prisoner and citizen, between hate and love. The story of the Italian prisoners of war who found love in small-town America became more than just a footnote in history. It became a testament to the power of individual choice to overcome even the deepest divisions. It proved that even in the darkest times, when nations are at war and hatred seems overwhelming, individual acts of kindness and courage can create connections that transcend boundaries and heal wounds that politics alone can never reach. Today, their descendants carry forward the legacy of that chocolate bar and the brave choice it represented. They understand that their very existence is proof that love is stronger than war, that humanity can triumph over enmity, and that sometimes the greatest victories are won not on battlefields, but in the quiet moments when we choose to see our enemies as human beings worthy of dignity and compassion,